Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Gentleman may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, continuing our observance of Black History Month, I was inspired by my seatmate, Delegate Keem, who eloquently shared how the civil rights movement and the struggle for equality for African Americans affected Asian Americans too. So as a Jew, I wanted to take a few moments to share some thoughts about the deep connection between Black history and the Jewish community in our country. My Jewish ancestors knew both the continuing indignities of second-class citizenship and the constant fear of xenophobic violence. Our history as Jews teaches us that discrimination against any member of the community threatens the security of the entire community. That's why the struggle for Black equality and for Jewish acceptance has been intertwined in American history. For example, Jews were among those who worked to establish the NAACP, and African American newspapers were among the first to speak out against Nazism. In the early 1900s, Jewish newspapers in this country drew parallels between the Black exodus out of the South after the Civil War and the Jewish escape from Egypt, pointing out that both Blacks and Jews lived in ghettos and calling anti-Black riots in the South pogroms, which is the Yiddish word describing state-sanctioned attacks on Jews in the Old Country. American Jewish leaders emphasized the idea that both groups would benefit the more America moved toward a society of merit, free of religious, ethnic, and racial restrictions. From the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, Blacks and Jews marched arm in arm. In 1909, W.E.B. Du Bois, Julius Rosenthal, Lillian Wald, Rabbi Emil Hirsch, Stephen Wise, and Henry Malkowitz formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. 1 year later, other prominent Jewish and Black leaders created the Urban League. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington worked closely together in 1912 to improve the educational system for Blacks in the South. In the 1930s and 40s, when Jewish refugee professors arrived from Europe at Southern Black colleges, there was a history of overt empathy between Blacks and Jews. These Jews organized dinners at which Blacks and whites would have to sit next to each other, a simple yet revolutionary act at that time. Black students empathized with the cruelty these Jewish scholars had endured in Europe and trusted them more because they also saw them as non-white. In fact, often Black students, as well as other members of the Southern white community, referred to these Jewish refugees not as white, but as some kind of colored folk. This special relationship took hold throughout the United States. The American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, and the Anti-Defamation League were central to the campaign against racial prejudice. Jews made substantial financial contributions to many civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, the Urban League, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. About half of all of the civil rights attorneys in the South during the 1960s were Jewish, as were over half of the non-Blacks who went to Mississippi in 1964 to challenge Jim Crow laws. Here in Virginia, the lawyer who in 1967 successfully stood up to the law against interracial marriage and in doing so secured that freedom for all Americans was, in addition to being a member of this esteemed body, and Mr. Speaker, I know that he was a friend of yours and he speaks highly of you, he was a Jew from Alexandria named Bernie Cohen. I wanted to share this photograph, which usually hangs in my office in the General Assembly building. This photograph depicts Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the front row of that great march at Selma, locked arm in arm with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Rabbi Heschel said of the march that they were praying with their feet. Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King marched arm in arm at Selma, prayed together in protest at Arlington National Cemetery, and stood side by side in the pulpit of Riverside Church. When the conservative rabbis of America gathered in 1968 to celebrate Rabbi Heschel's 60th birthday, the keynote speaker was Dr. Martin Luther King. When Dr. King was assassinated, Rabbi Heschel was the rabbi that Mrs. King invited to speak at the funeral. One has only to read Heschel and King to understand the spiritual connection between our two peoples. Heschel wrote, "The opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference. In a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible." King responded in agreement. To accept passively an unjust system is to cooperate with that system. The segregationists and the racists make no fine distinction between Negro and Jew. The long and proud tradition of two peoples marching arm in arm for freedom is a sometime overlooked aspect of Black History Month. And I want to honor that today, and I hope that that will continue for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.